The world of Ark Raiders is not a post-apocalyptic setting that begins with the Ark. It begins long before that. The lore scattered throughout the game, tucked into data logs, NPC dialogue, and environmental details, paints a picture of a civilization that had already started unraveling before the first Ark signal was ever detected. To understand why the humans were the real problem, you have to start here. You have to start with what they built, what they neglected, and what they chose to ignore. This chapter is about the pre-Ark world, and it is not a flattering portrait. The world before the Ark was one of extreme resource consolidation. A small number of mega-corporate structures had quietly absorbed the functions traditionally handled by governments. Infrastructure, communication, energy distribution, and even basic security had been handed over or slowly bled into private hands over decades of political erosion. This wasn't a dramatic coup. It was slow. It was bureaucratic, and by the time anyone looked up to notice, the transition was essentially complete. What this meant in practical terms was that when crisis came, and crisis always comes, the apparatus to respond to it was fragmented, profit-motivated, and largely unaccountable. The law suggests that multiple environmental and social crises preceded the Ark event by years, possibly decades. These weren't small things. Resource wars, infrastructure collapses, and mass displacement events are all referenced in passing across different in-game sources. They were managed poorly, unevenly, and often not at all. The underground networks that players navigate throughout the game were not built in response to the Ark. They were already there. Some of them were corporate bunkers, others were black market logistics tunnels. A few were refugee habitation zones that had been operating for years before the Ark showed up. The Ark didn't create the underground. The underground was already the only viable option for a large portion of the population. There's a particular detail in one of the early data logs that sticks with me. It references a corporate filing from before the Ark era, describing how certain surface regions had been officially reclassified as unviable for commercial activity. Not uninhabitable, just not profitable. The language is bureaucratic and clean, but what it describes is the deliberate abandonment of entire population zones because they couldn't generate returns. That is not a natural disaster. That is a choice. The communities that eventually become the scrapper culture central to the game's aesthetic were already forming in these abandoned zones. They were already salvaging, already building improvised systems, already operating outside official infrastructure. The Ark, in a grim irony, eventually made these communities uniquely suited to surviving because they had spent years learning how to function without the systems that everyone else depended on. One possible reading of the law is that the mega-corporate consolidation of the pre-Ark world wasn't just negligent, it was actively extractive. The data suggests that resources, technology, and social capital were being pulled upward into a smaller and smaller set of hands, while the broader infrastructure was left to slowly degrade. This is not a unique historical pattern, and the game seems aware of that. The energy infrastructure, in particular, is worth paying attention to. Multiple law sources reference power systems that had been stretched well beyond their designed capacity and kept running through improvised patches rather than proper maintenance. There are references to grid failures that affected large regions for extended periods. There are references to water treatment facilities operating on skeleton crews. The bones of civilization were showing long before the Ark arrived to break them. What the game suggests, when you pull all of this together, is that the Ark didn't cause the collapse of human civilization. It accelerated a collapse that was already in progress. This is a crucial distinction, and it reframes almost everything else in the game's lore. If the collapse was already underway, then the question of how to respond to the Ark becomes inseparable from the question of why the pre-existing systems were so brittle in the first place. The faction structures that emerge post-Ark all carry the fingerprints of the pre-Ark world. Their ideologies, their conflicts, their resource priorities all map onto divisions that already existed. You can trace the lines of tension in the post-Arch world directly back to the lines of tension in the pre-Arch world, and in many cases they are not just similar. They are the same lines. The Arch changed the terrain. It did not change the fundamental dynamics. There is a certain kind of storytelling that treats catastrophe as a reset button, as if massive trauma wipes the slate clean and forces people to rebuild from first principles. Arch Raiders does not do that. The lore consistently shows factions rebuilding the same structures, reimposing the same hierarchies, and repeating the same mistakes on a smaller scale with fewer resources. This is one of the darkest things about the game's world building, and it is also one of the most honest. The concept of a meritocratic survivor culture, where the best and most capable rise to the top because survival demands it, gets quietly dismantled throughout the lore. The people who end up with the most power in the post-Arch world are not the most capable survivors. They are the people who were already positioned to accumulate power and who managed to carry those advantages through the disruption. Wealth, social connections, access to pre-Arch technology, and organizational experience all transfer remarkably well across the apocalypse. The scrappers, the people who had already been living on the margins of the pre-Arch world, possess survival skills that the former managerial and administrative class largely lacks. But possessing survival skills and having structural power are not the same thing. The lore is quietly consistent on this point. Being good at surviving does not translate into being good at controlling resources, and controlling resources is still what determines outcomes in the post-Arch world. There is a thread of environmental data woven through the game that most players probably walk past without registering. Soil contamination readings, air quality indices, water table measurements. These are presented as ambient background detail, but they tell a story. The surface of the game world is not just dangerous because of the Arch. It is dangerous because of what humans did to it long before the Arch showed up. The two layers of danger are literally layered in the environmental data. One of the things that makes Arch Raiders world building unusually coherent is its treatment of technology. Pre-Arch technology is not presented as uniformly advanced. It's presented as advanced in some areas and strikingly neglected in others, which reflects the reality of how technology actually develops under profit-motivated systems. The things that made money got developed, the things that didn't got left behind. Medical technology is one example where the lore hints at extreme disparity. High-end medical intervention, life extension treatments, and advanced pharmaceuticals were available and apparently remarkable. Basic public health infrastructure was crumbling. These two facts coexisted in the pre-Arch world, and they coexist in the post-Arch world, just with different branding. The concept of corporate sovereignty is something the lore circles around without always naming directly. But the implication is clear in multiple sources. Certain corporate entities had effectively become state-level powers in the pre-Arch period, with their own security forces, their own legal frameworks, and their own territorial claims. When the Arch hit and state-level governments collapsed or fragmented, these corporate structures were in many ways better positioned to maintain continuity because they had never fully been dependent on those governments anyway. This is a point the game makes without quite editorializing on it. It just shows you the outcome. The post-Arch factions that have the most organizational coherence are the ones that have some kind of direct lineage to pre-Arch corporate or paramilitary structures. The factions built from the ground up by survivors from scratch tend to be more ideologically diverse and more internally contested, but also more organizationally fragile. The social stratification of the underground is not a post-Arch innovation. The lore makes clear that underground spaces had been socially stratified for years before the Arch arrived. Access to better sections, better resources, and better protection was already being bought and bartered. The Ark's arrival intensified this but did not create it. The hierarchy was already there, waiting for a new context. There is a data log that describes, in dry administrative language, the allocation of emergency bunker spaces in the period immediately following the first Ark strikes. The allocation process very closely mirrors the socio-economic distribution of the pre-Ark world. People with money, connections, and corporate affiliations got spaces. People without them did not. Whoever wrote that log seems either unaware of or entirely comfortable with what that says about how the emergency was managed. The point this chapter is building toward is not that the Ark was irrelevant. Clearly it was and is enormously consequential. The point is that the world was already structured in a way that made catastrophic failure likely, and that structure was the result of deliberate human choices made over a long period of time. The Ark is a catalyst and an accelerant, but the fuel was already there. What the game is doing with its pre-Ark world building, whether intentionally or not, is presenting a world that got the catastrophe it was more or less set up for. Not as punishment, not as karma, just as consequence. Systems that prioritize short-term extraction over long-term stability tend to be brittle. The law shows us a world that was brittle, and then it shows us what happens when you apply stress to something brittle. The underground cities where much of the game takes place are beautiful in a bruised, improvised way. The visual design communicates decades of layered habitation and adaptation. But what the law adds to that visual texture is a sense of deep historical weight. These spaces didn't just appear. They were built, modified, contested, and rebuilt across a long stretch of time. They carry the accumulated decisions of everyone who lived in them. Among those decisions are ones that most players probably don't think about while they're running operations. Decisions about where to put the medical bay versus where to put the power relay. Decisions about who gets access to the better corridors and who ends up in the lower sections, with the mold and the noise. These are small decisions, but the law accumulates them into a pattern. The pattern is familiar. It is the same pattern from the surface world, just reproduced underground. There is something almost suffocating about that. The idea that even in the context of total civilizational collapse, even with everything stripped down to survival basics, the same social machinery reasserts itself. The law doesn't romanticize the underground. It doesn't treat it as a fresh start or a more honest way of living. It treats it as a continuation, with different walls. The faction called the Raiders, the ones the player is associated with, exists in an interesting position relative to all of this. They are not the most powerful faction. They are not the most ideologically coherent faction. They are, in many ways, the faction that sits in the gap between the others. And what that position gives them is a kind of ground-level view of how all the other systems actually function versus how those systems present themselves. Much of the lore accessible to the player character comes through this ground-level lens. And from that lens, the most powerful factions look very different than they look in their own promotional materials. The gap between self-presentation and actual behaviour is one of the game's recurring themes, and it starts with the pre-Ark world, where corporations filed beautiful sustainability reports while actively polluting the water table. The environmental contamination that the game shows you is not incidental to the lore, it is central to it, because contamination is permanent in a way that other damages are not. You can rebuild a wall, you can replace a power relay, you cannot unpoison a water supply, at least not quickly, not cheaply, and not without resources most people don't have. The contamination is a record of decisions that can't be undone, and it is everywhere. One reading of the game's environmental design is as a kind of geological record of human failure. Each layer of contamination, each rusted infrastructure component, each collapsed support structure is a timestamp. It corresponds to a decision somewhere in the past, a cost-cutting measure, a deferred maintenance cycle, a resource extraction project that went over its permitted boundaries. The game lets you walk through the evidence. The Ark arrived into a world that had already been substantially damaged by its own inhabitants. This isn't a point the game makes loudly or with any particular moral emphasis. It just shows it. The data is in the environment. The testimony is in the logs. The conclusion is left to the player to draw. And the conclusion, when you draw it, is not comfortable, because it suggests that even if the Ark was somehow neutralized or removed from the equation, the underlying conditions that made the world so vulnerable would still be there. The same dynamics would still be operating. The same patterns would reassert themselves. The Ark is a problem, but it is not the only problem, and it might not even be the foundational one. There are NPC conversations in the game that touch on this directly, though usually obliquely. Characters who have been alive long enough to remember the pre-Ark world sometimes describe it in terms that are surprisingly ambivalent, not nostalgic, not clean-cut positive. They remember the problems. They remember the things that didn't work. And some of them, not all, but some, have a complicated relationship with the idea of going back. This is unusual for a post-apocalyptic setting. Most post-apocalyptic fiction treats the pre-collapse world as an Eden that was lost. The lore of Ark Raiders treats it more like a place that had serious problems that were being papered over, and that the Ark just removed the paper. Underneath the paper was the same set of problems, now fully exposed and no longer deniable. The radiation zones, the flooded corridors, the sections of the underground that have been sealed off because the contamination is too severe to address. These are not just gameplay obstacles. They are the physical manifestation of a long history of deferred costs. Someone decided not to fix those systems. Someone decided not to contain those materials. And now those decisions are load-bearing parts of the world, built into the architecture of survival. What the pre-Ark world's failures mean for the factions is something we will get into in later chapters. But the short version is that every faction is working with a compromised inheritance. Every faction is operating in a landscape that was shaped by decisions they didn't make. And every faction is, to varying degrees, making the same kinds of decisions again, just with fewer resources and higher stakes. The story of why humans were always the real problem does not start with the Ark. It starts long before. It starts with the choices about what to build, what to maintain, what to discard, and who to leave behind. By the time the Ark arrived, the world had already been answering those questions for generations. The answers it had given were written into the contaminated soil, the overloaded power grids, the abandoned population zones, and the underground cities that were already, before the Ark, home to people who had nowhere else to go. This chapter has been setting the table. The rest of this video is going to sit down and eat. Because once you understand the world the Ark arrived into, everything that happens next looks different. The factions, the conflicts, the technology choices, the moral compromises, they all make a different kind of sense. Not a comfortable sense, but a coherent one. The pre-Ark world was not a golden age, it was a slow emergency, and it produced people who were, depending on their position in the social structure, either extraordinarily equipped or extraordinarily ill-equipped to handle what came next. The distribution of those two groups was not random. It followed the same lines it always had, and those lines are still visible in the post-Ark world if you know where to look. The game knows where to look. It shows you. Quietly, without announcing itself, it shows you the bones of the old world and asks you to consider what they tell you about the world you're surviving in now. This is good science fiction. This is what the genre is supposed to do, and it is more effective for being delivered sideways through data logs and environmental contamination readings rather than through exposition. We are only at the beginning of this story. But the beginning is important because it is not where most people start when they talk about Ark Raiders lore. Most people start with the Ark. This video starts with the humans. And by the end, I think that choice will make sense. Chapter 2. The factions and the lies they tell themselves. If the pre-Arch world was built on deferred costs and institutional dishonesty, then the factions that emerged from its ruins are its legitimate heirs. They carry the same DNA. They reproduce the same patterns. And the most revealing thing about any of them is not what they do, but what story they tell about why they do it. This chapter is about those stories, the internal narratives that factions use to justify their behavior, to recruit members and to maintain cohesion, and the gap between those narratives and what the law actually shows. Every faction in Arch Raiders has an origin story, and every origin story is, at least in part, a myth. This is not a criticism. Every organization tells a version of its own history that emphasizes certain things and minimizes others. That's how identity works. The question is what the gap between the myth and the record reveals about the faction's actual priorities. The faction structures in the game are not presented as simple good versus evil alignments. This is one of the things Arch Raiders does well. Even the factions that are clearly more predatory or more authoritarian have members who believe genuinely in what they're doing. And even the factions that present themselves as more egalitarian or community-centered have practices that contradict those presentations. The law is consistent in showing this complexity. One of the dominant factions, operating in the upper sections of the underground infrastructure, draws its legitimacy from claims of technical competence and resource management expertise. Their narrative is essentially that the people best qualified to allocate resources should be the ones making decisions about allocation. This sounds reasonable on its face, and their members largely believe it. But the law suggests that their definitions of competence map very neatly onto pre-Arch social hierarchies, in ways that are probably not coincidental. The resource allocation patterns this faction oversees show a consistent tilt, not dramatic, not overtly discriminatory, just a consistent, statistically significant tilt toward people who look and sound and behave like the faction's leadership. This is not called out in any single document. It accumulates across multiple data sources. It is the kind of bias that is most effective precisely because it doesn't announce itself. Another faction, positioned more in the mid-levels and emphasizing military efficiency and operational clarity, tells a story about necessity. Their argument is essentially that soft priorities are a luxury the post-Arch world can't afford. Decisions need to be made fast, chains of command need to be clear. Individual considerations need to yield to collective survival. This is a coherent argument in genuine emergency conditions. The question the law raises is whether the emergency has been used to justify a permanent military structure that serves interests beyond the original crisis. There are data logs from early in this faction's formation that show a genuine emergency context. Conditions were dire, fast decisions were necessary. The chain of command structure that emerged probably did save lives in those early periods, but the law also shows this structure calcifying. The emergency powers don't get relaxed as conditions stabilize. The hierarchy doesn't flatten when the immediate crisis passes. Instead, the emergency framework becomes the permanent framework, just with the emergency language maintained to justify ongoing extraordinary measures. This is a pattern with deep historical roots, and the game seems to know that. The point at which emergency governance becomes permanent governance, and what that transition means for accountability, is a theme that runs through this faction's arc in the law. The people at the top of the chain believe in what they built, but what they built is something that concentrates power and removes the mechanisms for challenging that concentration. The third major faction type in Arch Raiders is the community-oriented one, and this is where the law is perhaps most subtle, because community-oriented factions are the ones it's easiest to romanticize, and Arch Raiders resists that. The community factions have genuine strengths. They have more distributed decision-making. They have stronger social bonds. They have more equitable resource practices, at least internally. But the law also shows their limitations and, more critically, their failure modes. Community factions in the game tend to be territorial in a specific way. Their egalitarianism operates within the community boundary. Outside that boundary, the same exclusionary logic that governs less egalitarian factions reasserts itself. Outsiders are treated with suspicion, sometimes with hostility. Resources are not shared with those who haven't earned community membership. The warmth and solidarity that characterizes internal relations doesn't extend outward, and the game notes this without over-dramatizing it. There is a log that describes a community faction refusing to share water filtration capacity with a nearby group of unaffiliated survivors during a crisis period. The refusal is documented in the faction's own records. The reasoning given is that their own population needs came first. This is understandable. It is also a choice with consequences, and the law tracks those consequences without resolving them neatly. The unaffiliated survivors in that situation were eventually absorbed into a different, less community-oriented faction that offered them protection in exchange for labour commitments and military service. The community faction that refused them has no recorded reflection on this outcome. It happened. It had effects, and everyone moved on. This is how the game handles moral complexity, not with speeches and confrontations, but with documented outcomes and silence. The Raiders, as a faction identity, are interesting because they are explicitly defined as operating outside the main faction structures. This gives them narrative flexibility, but it doesn't put them outside the dynamics the other factions are caught in. The law shows the Raiders struggling with the same pressures: resource scarcity, internal disagreements about priorities, tensions between individual autonomy and collective decision-making. They're just dealing with those pressures with fewer resources and less established infrastructure than the larger factions. What the Raiders do have is access. Their operational range puts them in contact with all the major factions. They work with and for factions that are sometimes in direct conflict with each other. This means they have a broader view than most, and the law they accumulate reflects that broader view. They see the gap between faction narratives and faction behaviours more clearly than most faction members do, because they've been told different versions of the same events by different people with different interests. One of the recurring dynamics in Raider law is the experience of being used as a buffer or a plausible deniability mechanism by larger factions. Operations that a major faction needs done but doesn't want officially attributed to them get run through Raider crews. The Raiders get paid, the work gets done. The major faction maintains its narrative integrity. This arrangement is not unique to any single faction. Every major group uses independence this way when convenient. What this reveals is that the factions are not just managing resources and populations, they are managing narratives. And the narrative management is in some ways as important as the resource management. Because if a faction story about itself starts to crack, the social cohesion that makes the faction function starts to crack with it. Narrative integrity is a load-bearing element in every faction structure. The game shows you moments where that narrative integrity is visibly strained. Data logs that record decisions quietly made without broader community awareness. Resource discrepancies that get documented in internal ledgers but never surface in public communications. Personnel decisions that contradict stated meritocratic principles. These are not dramatic exposés. They're just the paper trail that accumulates when organizations operate over time. The parallel to the pre-Arch world is not subtle, but it's not heavy-handed either. The game just puts the documents in front of you and lets you connect the dots. The same gap between official narrative and internal record that characterized the pre-Arch mega-corporations is visible in every post-Arch faction. The scale is smaller, the stakes are different, but the pattern is the same. What does it mean that human beings reproduce these patterns even under the extreme conditions of post-Arch survival? One possible reading is that it's simply a feature of how human social organization works. That hierarchy, narrative management, and in-group/out-group dynamics are not products of any particular political or economic system, but fundamental aspects of how groups of humans function. The game doesn't offer a direct argument for or against this reading. It just shows you the pattern. Another possible reading is that these patterns are reproduced because the people doing the reproducing were shaped by the pre-Arch world and carry its assumptions with them. On this reading, the patterns aren't inevitable. They're inherited. They're the default setting of people who grew up inside a particular kind of civilization. And defaults can be changed, even if changing them is very hard. The factions themselves are divided on this implicit question, though not in those terms. The community factions tend to believe, or at least claim to believe, that different structures are possible. The more hierarchical factions tend to treat their structures as the practical response to reality rather than a choice among options. Both positions have evidence in the law. Neither fully accounts for everything the law shows. What the law most consistently shows is that the gap between what factions say and what they do is never fully closed. And that gap, maintained across all the major factions, is itself a kind of argument. It suggests that the problem is not with any particular faction's design, but with something more fundamental about how power is accumulated and how it behaves once accumulated, regardless of the institutional framework it operates within. The factions also lie to their enemies in ways that are interesting. Propaganda about opposing factions circulates in the underground, and the law gives you enough context to see the distortions. The military faction portrays community factions as dangerously inefficient and naive. Community factions portray the military faction as fascist and exploitative. The resource management faction presents everyone else as irrational actors. All of these portrayals contain real observations, and all of them are also weapons. What is interesting is that the propaganda is most effective on the people who have had the least direct contact with the faction being portrayed. The more a raider crew works around a given faction, the less they tend to believe the extreme versions of what other factions say about them. The propaganda model requires distance. Up close, people are more complicated than the story requires. This might be the most quietly optimistic thing in the game's lore, that direct human contact tends to complicate the narratives that factions use to dehumanize and dismiss each other. Not eliminate them, not resolve the actual conflicts, but complicate them, make them harder to sustain with full conviction. The game seems to believe that complexity is generated by contact, and that sustained contact between different groups makes pure ideological commitment increasingly difficult. Whether that's enough to actually change anything is a different question, and the law is not hopeful about it. The system-level dynamics are strong enough to override individual complexity most of the time. But the fact that complexity exists, that characters in the game hold contradictory beliefs and have relationships that cross faction lines, is worth noting as a data point in the larger argument about human nature. The factions are also in competition, not just for resources, but for relevance. In the post-Arch world, relevance means being the faction that people choose to affiliate with, depend on, and die for. Relevance is manufactured through services rendered, through protection provided, and through narrative, the story about who you are and why your version of survival is the right one. Competition for narrative space is in some ways as intense as competition for material resources. This competition produces a specific kind of dishonesty that is not exactly lying. It's more like selective truth. Each faction tells the true parts of its story loudly and clearly, and lets the true parts of other stories go unreported. This is not unique to the game's factions. It is recognizable from every organization that has ever had a communication strategy. The game just places it in a context where the stakes are stark enough that the stakes of narrative management become visible In a way, they usually aren't. The raiders, again, are well positioned to observe all of this, and the law reflects it. There is a dry quality to many of the raider-associated data logs, a kind of weary irony about the gap between stated and actual motivations. The raiders have seen too many competing factions tell too many versions of the same story to be fully taken in by any of them. This doesn't make them neutral or above the fray. They have their own interests and their own self-serving narratives, but the awareness of narrative as a tool is more visible in their records than in most. The children in the law, the younger generation born into or very early into the post-Arch world, are an interesting case. They have no direct experience of the pre-Arch world. Their baseline is the underground and the factions and the Arch-damaged surface. What the game suggests, very cautiously, is that their relationship to faction ideology is different from their parents' generation. Not necessarily healthier or clearer, just different, shaped by different defaults. Whether this represents a possibility of change or just a new set of inherited assumptions being formed is something the law leaves genuinely open. There are young characters who seem to be reproducing pre-Arch patterns with great enthusiasm. There are young characters who seem to be constructing something genuinely different, or trying to. The game doesn't tell you which tendency will win. It notes both and lets the question sit. The factions lie to themselves most effectively, the law suggests, when they are under stress. Under stress, the comforting story becomes not just a narrative, but a necessity. The mechanism that generates self-deception is the same one that generates organizational coherence under pressure. You cannot fully separate them. The beliefs that bind a faction together are often also the beliefs that prevent it from accurately assessing its own behavior. This is one of the darkest threads in the game's lore. Not because it's unfamiliar, because it's accurate, and because it suggests that the problem isn't specific individuals making bad choices or specific factions with bad values. It's the structure of how belief, identity, and institutional interest interact. That structure is robust, it survives catastrophe, it reasserts itself in the ruins. By the end of this chapter, I hope the picture taking shape is one of humans who are not simply flawed in obvious ways, but flawed in structural ways. The factions they build are not just imperfect versions of better systems. They are systems that produce certain predictable outcomes regardless of the values of their founders. And those outcomes tend to concentrate power, manage narratives, and reproduce the conditions that made the pre-Arch world so brittle. This is the case the law builds, not with speeches, not with villains, just with data logs and environmental details and the accumulated weight of documented decisions. The humans were always the real problem, not because humans are irredeemably bad, but because the systems they build and the stories they tell about those systems tend to defeat the better intentions of the people operating them. Chapter 3. The technology that was always a weapon. Technology in Arch Raiders is never neutral. This is one of the clearest arguments the law makes, and it makes it consistently across every type of technology you encounter in the game. The energy systems, the communication networks, the medical equipment, the Arch-related tech, and especially the weapons. None of it exists outside of a context of power, and that context shapes what the technology does and who it does it to. This chapter is about the technology of the pre-Arch world and what it reveals about the priorities of the civilization that built it. The law makes clear that the pre-Arch world was technologically impressive in specific ways. Energy generation had reached a point where large-scale infrastructure could be maintained almost indefinitely with minimal human oversight, assuming the maintenance systems themselves were kept functional. Communication networks were sophisticated enough to provide near real-time information transfer across very large geographic areas. Medical technology, for those who had access to it, had extended lifespans and addressed conditions that previous generations would have considered untreatable. But the emphasis on specific capabilities tells you what was being invested in. The energy systems were built to serve dense, commercially active areas. The communication networks were built around surveillance and commercial data transmission, first with public communication as a secondary function. The medical technology was expensive and access restricted. The shape of the technological investment reflects a particular set of priorities, and those priorities were not primarily about broad human welfare. There is a distinction the law draws between public-facing technology and operational technology that is worth paying attention to. Public-facing technology in the pre-Arch world was designed to be visible, to demonstrate capability, to communicate advancement and progress. Operational technology, the stuff that actually kept the systems running, was often much older, less impressive, and significantly more fragile. The gap between the flagship demonstrations and the actual infrastructure was substantial. This gap had real consequences when the Arch hit. The systems that looked most capable were not necessarily the most resilient. The systems that were actually keeping things running, the aging power relays, the patchwork water treatment networks, the decades-old communication backbones, these were the things that failed first because they had been the least maintained and the most quietly depended upon. There is a data log describing a corporate presentation from the pre-Arch period that emphasizes a new generation of surface-level energy harvesting technology. The presentation is confident, glossy, and forward-looking. A note attached to the same file, clearly from an internal technical review, describes the existing grid infrastructure as critically undermaintained and at genuine risk of cascading failure. The presentation happened anyway. The infrastructure concerns were flagged and filed. The pre-Arch world's relationship with its own technical warnings is a recurring theme in the law. There are multiple instances of internal technical assessments that identified critical failure risks and were subsequently buried, delayed, or deprioritized for economic reasons. The pattern is consistent enough that it reads as systemic rather than exceptional. The warnings were generated by the same systems that ignored them. This is relevant to the Arch event because one possible reading of certain law sources is that the Arch's ability to infiltrate and disrupt human technological systems was facilitated in part by pre-existing vulnerabilities in those systems. The Arch didn't just attack well-maintained infrastructure, it attacked infrastructure that had decades of accumulated technical debt. Some of the Arch's most effective early disruptions suggest it found pathways that competent maintenance would have closed. This is not to say the Arch was not dangerous. It clearly was, and is. But the law hints that the ease and speed of certain Arch infiltrations correlates with the specific locations where infrastructure neglect was worst. There are Arch strike records that, when mapped against the maintenance histories of the affected systems, show a pattern that is difficult to attribute purely to Arch tactical intelligence. The weakest points were hit first, and the weakest points were weak because of human choices. The weapons technology of the pre-Arch world is its own category of analysis. The law shows a world that invested heavily in weapons development, perhaps more heavily than in almost any other technical domain relative to its social returns. The variety, sophistication, and sheer volume of weapons that players encounter in salvage contexts suggests a civilization that considered arms development a priority and a growth industry. What is interesting is that the pre-Arch world's weapons were developed to deal with threats that were, overwhelmingly, human. The weapons were designed for human conflict, scaled for human conflict, and optimized against human-level opposition. When the Arch arrived representing a genuinely different kind of threat, there was significant lag in developing effective responses because the entire weapons development apparatus had been oriented toward a different problem set. This is documented in the law through references to early post-Arch engagement records that show human forces using doctrine and weapons designed for human warfare against Arch entities, with predictably poor results. The translation problem was not just tactical, it was architectural. The weapon systems available to the best-equipped human forces in the early Arch period were not designed for this, and redesigning them required resources, time, and institutional flexibility that the situation did not afford. The improvised weapons and tactical modifications that become central to the game's aesthetic are born from this failure. They represent human adaptation under pressure, and they are genuinely impressive. But they are also a record of an earlier failure. The sophisticated weapons development apparatus of the pre-Arch world had focused on the wrong problem because the wrong problem was the one with the military contracts attached to it. Medical technology's dual-use history in the Arch Raiders lore is quietly disturbing. There are references to pre-Arch medical research programs that had ostensibly civilian applications, but were funded and directed in ways that suggest other interests. The line between pharmaceutical research, performance enhancement research, and weapons research in the pre-Arch lore is blurrier than the funding categories suggest. Several post-Arch factions make use of medical-adjacent technologies in ways that would not have been permitted under the pre-Arch world's formal regulations. But the infrastructure for those technologies was built within those regulations anyway. The surveillance technology built into pre-Arch infrastructure is perhaps the most directly weaponized civilian tech in the lore. Communication networks that were presented as connectivity infrastructure were also comprehensive surveillance systems. This is not revealed through a dramatic plot twist. The lore just documents it matter-of-factly, as if noting an obvious and widely understood fact. The post-Arch factions that control communication infrastructure control it partly because of the surveillance value, not just the communication value. There is a particular passage in a faction administrative log that describes using pre-Arch surveillance infrastructure to monitor the movements and communications of citizens within the faction's territory. The language in the log is entirely administrative, entirely concerned with operational efficiency. There is no reflection on the implications. This is what normalized surveillance looks like in practice. It becomes a tool of governance, and the people using it stop seeing it as anything other than a tool. The Arch's own technology, or at least what human researchers have been able to study and document about it, presents an interesting mirror. The lore suggests that Arch technology is also not neutral, that it operates according to its own logic and priorities, and that its interactions with human systems are shaped by that logic in ways humans are still working to understand. But this chapter is about human technology, so the Arch's tech is secondary here. What matters for this chapter is what human technology choices reveal about human values. Energy weapons and their proliferation across all factions in the post-Arch world tell a particular story. In the pre-Arch world, advanced energy weapons were mostly restricted to high-end military and security contractors. In the post-Arch world, the combination of salvaged pre-Arch tech, improvised manufacturing, and desperate need has distributed these capabilities much more broadly. This democratization of destructive capability is not presented as straightforwardly positive or negative. It has complicated the power dynamics between factions in ways that are genuinely ambiguous. The small factions, the communities that would have been completely outmatched by larger groups in the immediate post-Arch period, have used salvaged and improvised weapons technology to maintain a degree of independence they could not otherwise sustain. This is real. The lore acknowledges it. At the same time, the same distribution of capability has made certain types of conflict more lethal and certain de-escalation mechanisms more difficult to maintain. The same technology does both things. Construction technology is an underappreciated category in the Arch Raiders lore. The underground spaces of the game are built from an extraordinary mixture of time periods: pre-Arch commercial infrastructure, pre-Arch bunker construction, early post-Arch emergency modifications, and ongoing improvised construction are all layered on top of each other. The construction technology available at each stage reflects the material and knowledge resources available and tracking those changes tells you a lot about how conditions evolved. The early post-arc construction is often brutally pragmatic. Fast, resource-efficient, structurally adequate, but barely. As communities stabilized, construction got better, more considered, more durable. But the improvements are uneven. Better resourced communities built better structures. Communities with less access to materials and expertise built what they could. The physical quality of the built environment in the underground maps onto social stratification in ways that are visible and measurable. Communication technology in the post-arc world is particularly contested, and the law reflects this. Controlling communication means controlling information, and controlling information is a form of power. The factions that have the most robust communication infrastructure are not using it only for coordination. They're using it for the same purposes pre-arc institutions used it for: surveillance, narrative management, and the management of what people know and don't know. There is a network of unofficial, improvised communication systems in the game that exist outside faction control. The law around these systems is interesting because they function as an alternative information ecosystem. The information that circulates through these unofficial channels is not necessarily more accurate than official faction communications, but it is differently motivated. The unofficial networks have their own biases and failure modes. But their existence represents a recognition by the people using them that official channels are not fully trustworthy. This is a technology story, but it is also a power story. The question of who controls the infrastructure is also the question of who controls the information environment. And the information environment is where narrative management happens. The factions understand this. The law around communication control is some of the most operationally detailed in the game, suggesting that the people running these factions take it very seriously. The Ark's interaction with human technology is documented in the law through a series of after-action reports and technical analyses that show a consistent pattern. The Ark seems to be particularly effective at disrupting technologies that depend on specific frequencies, specific power signatures, or specific communication protocols. What is interesting is that many of the most vulnerable human systems were built to those exact specifications, because those specifications were industry standards, and industry standards are built for efficiency, not for resilience against a novel threat. This is another version of the same failure pattern. Pre-Arc technology was optimized for the known operating environment. It was built for efficiency within that environment. When the environment changed catastrophically, the optimization became a vulnerability. The things that made the systems efficient under normal conditions made them brittle under the new conditions. Adaptation required not just technical modification, but also a philosophical shift in how systems were designed. That philosophical shift is something different. Factions have managed to different degrees. The factions that have made the most effective post-arc technological adaptations tend to be the ones that were already operating outside standard pre-arc infrastructure. For whatever reason, the improvised, the marginal, the technically self-reliant. Their pre-arc disadvantage, not having access to the best standard systems, became a post-arc advantage, not being dependent on them. Medical technology, as it exists in the underground, is a particularly grim category. The gap between what is theoretically possible and what is actually available is stark. Pre-arc medical capabilities were advanced enough to handle most of what survival in the underground produces, in theory. In practice, the facilities, the trained personnel, the pharmaceuticals, and the power required to run that equipment are all scarce and unevenly distributed. The result is a medical system that reproduces the same triage logic as every other resource system. Those with more access get better care. The game does not dramatize individual deaths from treatable conditions. It just documents the resource distribution patterns and lets you do the math. You can look at the medical resource allocation in a given faction-controlled area and derive from that who is being prioritized and who is not. The math is not comfortable, and it is entirely consistent with the pre-Arc patterns of healthcare access the law establishes early on. The improvised technology that is most celebrated in the game's culture, the clever modifications, the ingenious repurposings, the things raiders and scrapper communities build from salvaged components, all of it points toward a kind of adaptive intelligence that the pre-Arc world did not reward or cultivate at the institutional level. These skills existed in people, particularly in people at the margins of the pre-Arc economy, who had always had to improvise. They were just not the skills that the major institutions valued. The post-Arc world has found itself dependent on exactly those skills and exactly those people. Whether this dependence translates into actual power for those communities or just another form of exploitation under different branding is something the law is careful not to resolve cleanly. The skills are valued now. Whether the people possessing them are valued in the sense that matters is a different question. By the end of this chapter, the technology story the law tells has a clear shape. Technology in the Arc Raiders world, both pre- and post-Arc, is a record of priorities. What got built, what got maintained, what got weaponized, and what got neglected are all answers to questions about what mattered and to whom. The Arc exposed the brittleness of what had been built, but the brittleness was built in. The technology that was supposed to be the foundation of human civilization turned out to be built on a foundation of assumptions that didn't hold up. Chapter 4: The Children of the Catastrophe. The generation born into, or very near the beginning of, the post-Arc world occupies a unique position in the law. They are the first humans to have no direct memory of the pre-Arc world, and the law uses this generation, carefully and without sentimentality, to ask what it means to be shaped entirely by catastrophe. Not catastrophe as a temporary condition to be endured until things return to normal, but catastrophe as the only normal there has ever been. This chapter is about those people, and what the law suggests about what they inherited. Before getting into the specifics, it is worth noting that Arc Raiders' treatment of its younger characters is unusual for the genre. Post-apocalyptic fiction tends to either idealize the younger generation as a source of hope and renewal, or use them as symbols of loss, innocence destroyed by a cruel world. The law in this game does neither. The younger characters are people. They are shaped by their environment in ways that are sometimes admirable and sometimes troubling, and the law tracks both dimensions with equal attentiveness. The most basic shaping force for this generation is scarcity. Not the scarcity of the pre-Arc world, which was manufactured scarcity, the result of distribution failures and political choices rather than absolute resource limits. The post-Arc scarcity is more immediate. Resources are genuinely limited in many areas. Energy, water, food, medicine, and space are all constrained in ways that require active management. Growing up inside genuine scarcity shapes the relationship to resources in specific ways. The law shows young characters who are extraordinarily competent at resource management at a tactical level. The ability to assess a salvage situation quickly, to estimate yield against cost, to make fast decisions about what to take and what to leave. These skills are highly developed in the generation that grew up in the underground. What is interesting is that these same characters often show very different profiles when it comes to strategic resource thinking, the longer-term, systems-level view of resource allocation and distribution. This is not a character flaw, it is a developmental outcome. If your formative years are structured around the tactical problem of daily survival, you develop tactical competence. Strategic thinking requires a different kind of exposure: stability, time, access to information about larger systems. The young generation in the underground has had less of that exposure than their predecessors, and the shape of their thinking reflects it. The factions understand this, the more sophisticated ones, and they use it. A population that thinks tactically is easier to manage than one that thinks strategically. Tactical thinkers can be directed. Strategic thinkers ask different questions and are harder to contain. There are law sources that suggest some faction leadership explicitly cultivates tactical competence in younger populations while limiting access to the kinds of education and information that would build strategic capacity. This is not stated as a conspiracy, it is implied through resource allocation patterns for educational programming. What is interesting is that the tactical competence of the younger generation is also genuinely useful to the factions, not just ideologically convenient. Raiders born in the post-Arc period are often tactically superior to older raiders in operational contexts. Their reflexes, their environmental reading, their ability to function under stress, all of these are highly developed. The factions benefit from this directly, in the form of effective operational personnel. The psychological landscape of this generation is documented in scattered ways throughout the law. There is very little documented depression or post-traumatic response in the way the previous generation shows it. And one possible reading of this is simply that the diagnostic and treatment infrastructure for those conditions is essentially gone. Another reading is that the conditions that generate those responses, the violation of expectations, the grief for a world that should have existed but didn't, simply don't apply in the same way to people who never had those expectations. This is not the same as psychological health. The law is careful not to conflate resilience with wellness. What it shows instead is a different shape of psychological response to difficulty. Less acute breakdown, perhaps, more chronic adaptation, more normalized tolerance for conditions that the previous generation finds horrifying, because to this generation, those conditions are just conditions, not departures from an expected standard. The concept of home is markedly different for this generation, according to the law. The previous generation carries mental maps of the surface world, of places they came from, of spaces that had meaning before the Ark. The younger generation's mental geography is almost entirely underground. The surface for many of them is not home, it is a work zone, a salvage environment, a dangerous place you go when you need to and leave when you can. This reorientation of the meaning of surface versus underground is more significant than it might first appear. It means the pre-Ark surface world is not for this generation a lost home to be mourned or recovered. It is a historical condition that preceded their existence. The emotional valence attached to restoration, to rebuilding the pre-Ark world, which is a powerful motivator for the older generation and a cornerstone of several faction narratives, simply doesn't land the same way with the young. This is a source of quiet tension in the law. Faction narratives that are built around restoration of pre-Ark conditions, or around the idea that the underground existence is a temporary emergency before a return to surface normality, have diminishing resonance as the generation with direct surface world memory ages and the generation without it grows larger. The factions are working on a timeline. Their foundational narratives have expiration dates. The relationships the young generation form with Ark technology are fascinating, and from some faction perspectives, alarming. Growing up in a world where Ark-derived or Ark-influenced technology is simply part of the material, environment produces a different relationship to it than the fear and hostility of the older generation. Some of the law references young scrappers and engineers who work with recovered Ark components in ways that would horrify most established faction technicians, not out of recklessness, but out of a practical orientation that starts from what is available rather than from what is ideologically acceptable. This pragmatism is both dangerous and valuable. It is dangerous because Ark technology is genuinely not fully understood, and working with it carries real risks. but the law suggests it also produces occasional insights and adaptations that more ideologically constrained approaches miss. The young people who are most willing to engage directly and practically with ARC materials are also the ones making some of the most interesting technical discoveries. The social structures the young generation builds in the spaces where they have the latitude to build their own structures rather than inheriting faction structures are worth paying attention to. The law shows several examples of youth-created spaces and organizations, and their characteristics are noticeably different from the dominant faction models. More fluid hierarchies, more explicit negotiation of shared standards, more tolerance for ambiguity in affiliation. Whether this represents a genuinely different set of values or just an early-stage version of the same hierarchies that will calcify over time is something the law doesn't resolve. There are older characters who look at young built structures with a kind of nostalgic recognition, suggesting they see the early stages of something they've seen before. There are also characters who find those structures genuinely unfamiliar, suggesting something different might be happening. The question of memory transmission is central to what the law says about this generation. What did they know about the pre-Arc world, and what do they know about how the Arc event happened? The answer is complicated. They know what they've been told, which is filtered through faction narratives and the selective memories of older people. They know what the archives contain, which is fragmentary and access-controlled. And they know what the physical environment shows them, which is the most unfiltered record available. There is something poignant in the law about young people reading the physical environment, the contamination levels, the construction strata, the equipment dates on salvaged machinery, as a way of reconstructing a past they have no direct experience of. This is the archaeology of daily survival. They are reading their own world as an artifact and trying to understand what it was before they were part of it. The conclusions they reach are not always the ones older generation members would endorse. One of the things physical environment reading tends to produce, according to the law, is a more complicated view of the pre-Arc world than faction narratives typically offer. The physical evidence of environmental degradation, of infrastructure neglect, of the way the underground spaces were already built and inhabited before the Arc, gives the young generation access to a version of history that complicates simple narratives of a lost paradise. They can see that the paradise was not, in fact, paradise for everyone. This complicating of the pre-Arc myth is something several factions are quietly anxious about, according to the law. Narratives of restoration and return depend on the object of restoration being clearly better than the present. If that clarity starts to blur, if the pre-Arc world starts to look complicated and contested rather than simply superior, the motivation for restoration projects weakens. And several factions have significant political and organizational investment in restoration as a goal. The education provided to young people in faction-controlled spaces is, accordingly, carefully managed. The history that is taught emphasizes the loss of the pre-Arc world rather than its problems. The Arc is presented as the sole cause of collapse, rather than as an accelerant of existing trends. This is not presented in the law as a dramatic conspiracy. It is just the normal operation of institutions managing their own legitimizing narratives. But the physical environment persists outside of narrative management. And young people who are tactically oriented, who are trained from childhood to read environments for survival information, read those narratives against the physical record. Some of them draw no particular conclusions from the discrepancies. Some of them draw significant ones. The law tracks both outcomes without editorializing on which is the correct response. The relationship between the post-Arc young generation and violence is handled with particular care in the law. This is a generation that has grown up in an environment where violence is a real and regular presence, where threat assessment is a survival skill, and where the use of force is legitimized by multiple competing frameworks, simultaneously. Their relationship to violence is neither the pre-Arch civilian sense of it as exceptional and shocking, nor quite the soldier's sense of it as a professional domain. It is something more normalized and more complex. What this produces behaviorally is a population that can engage with lethal force functionally and without extended processing time, but that does not necessarily carry the same ideological frameworks about justified and unjustified violence that older generation members learned from pre-Arch social contexts. This is not the same as lacking moral frameworks. The law shows young characters with clear and often thoughtfully developed ethical positions, but those positions were not pre-installed by the pre-Arch social consensus. They were built from scratch in a different environment. Faction leadership tends to find this flexibility both useful and unsettling. Young fighters who can engage without hesitation and then disengage without lasting trauma are operationally excellent. But young fighters who haven't fully internalized faction-specific narratives about who the enemies are and why are also potentially less reliably directed. The usefulness and the risk coexist. There is a long data log, one of the more substantial pieces of lore in the game, that consists of conversations between young raiders and an older raider who is trying to pass on operational experience and historical context. What is striking about the exchange is how much the older raider assumes the young people know that they don't, and how much they know that the older raider hasn't accounted for. The knowledge mismatch runs in both directions. The older raider has surface world experience and pre-Arch context that the young people lack. The young people have post-Arch operational knowledge and Arch technology familiarity that the older raider underestimates. The conversation is not harmonious, but it is productive, and the log documents a kind of mutual recalibration happening across the generational divide, each party updating their assessment of the other over the course of the exchange. This is one of the more hopeful things in the game's lore. Not hope in a triumphant sense, but the possibility of genuine knowledge transfer in both directions across the generational divide, if people are willing to actually hear each other, rather than just transmit their own version of events. The willingness seems partial and conditional in the log, but it exists. The post-Arch young generation is not the future of humanity in the sentimental sense. The lore does not set them up as the ones who will finally get it right. They have their own set of blindnesses, their own inherited patterns that will need to be questioned, their own defaults that will require examination, but they are also genuinely different in some ways that matter. Their relationship to the pre-Arch world as an object of reverence, or as a goal of restoration, is attenuated. They are more likely to start from where they are. Whether starting from where they are produces better or worse outcomes than the restoration projects of the older generation is genuinely unclear in the lore. Both approaches have costs. Starting from the present means potentially discarding useful knowledge from the pre-Arch world. Focusing on restoration means potentially rebuilding something that was already broken. The lore holds this tension without resolving it. What the young generation represents most clearly in the lore is a test of whether the patterns documented throughout the rest of this video are truly systemic, or whether they are contingent on the specific historical formation of people who lived through the pre-Arch period. If the same patterns reassert themselves fully in the generation that has no direct memory of that world, that is strong evidence for the systemic view. If something genuinely different emerges, that is evidence for the contingent view. The lore characteristically gives you evidence for both. The patterns are visibly reasserting in some young communities and in some young characters, and something that looks genuinely different is tentatively emerging in others. The outcome is not predetermined in the world of Arch Raiders. It is being contested without most of the people involved being fully aware that that is what they're doing. The children of the Catastrophe are not the heroes of this lore. They are not the villains either. They are the people living inside the consequences of decisions they didn't make, trying to build something survivable from material they didn't choose. In this, they are not different from every generation that has ever lived, but their material is particularly stark, and the law treats them with the seriousness that deserves. Chapter 5. What the Ark revealed. The Ark's arrival in the world of Ark raiders is, in one dominant narrative framework, the central catastrophe of the story. The machine invasion from above that ended one era and forced the beginning of another. But the law supports a different reading, one that this entire video has been building toward. The Ark did not create the conditions for human suffering and failure. It revealed them. It stripped away the systems and narratives that had been managing and concealing those conditions and left the underlying structures exposed and undeniable. This final chapter is about what the Ark specifically revealed and what that revelation means for how you understand everything that came before and after it. The Ark is not a character in this chapter, it is a lens, and what you see through that lens is, as I said at the beginning, uncomfortable. The first thing the Ark revealed was how much of the pre-Ark world's apparent stability was dependent on fragile systems being maintained. When those systems failed, the populations that had been most dependent on them had the least capacity to adapt. The populations that had been living at the margins, maintaining their own parallel systems, out of necessity, adapted most quickly. This is documented clearly in the post-Ark survival data referenced in the law. The pre-Ark world's stability was real, in the sense that it maintained conditions in which a large number of people could survive, and in some cases thrive. But it was also maintained at the cost of significant hidden stress. Resources were being extracted at unsustainable rates. Infrastructure was being maintained at below replacement investment levels. Social systems that appeared stable were being held in place by increasing pressure rather than genuine equilibrium. The Ark applied force to a structure that was already under strain. What this means, and this is the argument the law makes most quietly and most persistently, is that the Ark is not responsible for the brittleness of the world it attacked. The brittleness was pre-existing. The decisions that created the brittleness were made by humans over a long period of time, and for reasons that were locally rational, even when they were globally destructive. The Ark just made the brittleness impossible to ignore. The second thing the Ark revealed was the hierarchy of actual priority beneath the stated hierarchy of priority. In the pre-Ark world, official communications and institutional statements established a hierarchy of values: human welfare, social stability, technological progress, and so on. The actual hierarchy, the one you can read from resource allocation records and infrastructure investment patterns, was different. The Ark period created conditions in which the official hierarchy was practically inoperable, and the actual hierarchy became the only one operating. What you see in the early post-Ark period, documented in the law through emergency allocation records and faction formation histories, is the actual hierarchy naked and working at full speed. Resources flowed toward the people and structures that had always been the priority. The official language of welfare and equity was suspended as an emergency measure. The suspension then became the new normal, because the actual hierarchy had always been the operating one. The emergency just removed the cover. This is one of the hardest things the law says about the pre-Ark world. Not that it failed, but that what it was claiming to value and what it was actually valuing were different, and that this difference was decisive when the pressure became extreme enough to force a choice. The choice, when forced, was made in the same direction it had always been made when the stakes were high enough. Continuity of the existing power structure above most other considerations. The third thing the Ark revealed was the limits of purely technical solutions to fundamentally social problems. One of the dominant tendencies in several pre-Ark institutions, and one that is reproduced in several post-Ark factions, is to respond to social problems with technical solutions. The problem of resource inequity gets addressed with efficiency improvements. The problem of social cohesion gets addressed with communication technology. The problem of political instability gets addressed with surveillance and security infrastructure. What the Arc period shows repeatedly is that this approach has a ceiling. Technical efficiency in an unjust distribution system still produces an unjust distribution. Better communication infrastructure still transmits misinformation if misinformation is what the institutions using it produce. Better security infrastructure still oppresses if oppression is what it's deployed for. The technical capability and the social outcome are not the same thing, and addressing the first does not automatically address the second. The factions that have been most technically effective in the post-Arc period are not the ones with the best technology in absolute terms. They are the ones that match their technical capabilities to their social organization in ways that produce genuine coherence. This is rare, and the law treats it as rare. Most factions have technical capabilities that exceed what their social organization can effectively use, or social organizations that their technical infrastructure can't adequately support. The mismatch is itself a legacy of the pre-Arc tendency to solve social problems technically. The fourth thing the Arc revealed was how much narrative work was being done to maintain the pre-Arc world's self-image. This is the most abstract of the revelations, but possibly the most significant. The pre-Arc world had an extensive apparatus for managing its own story, institutions of journalism and information management, educational systems with particular content priorities, political and corporate communication operations of considerable sophistication. All of this apparatus was devoted, in significant part, to maintaining a specific story about the pre-Arc world and the people running it. The Arc disrupted this apparatus, not completely, not everywhere at once, but the disruption was sufficient to let an enormous amount of material into public circulation that the apparatus had previously managed. Internal communications, allocation records, technical assessments, personnel decisions, the kinds of documentary evidence that are produced constantly in any large organization, and that, under normal conditions, are managed carefully and released only in forms that support official narratives. What this material showed in the aggregate was a set of institutions that were much more consistent about protecting specific interests than about protecting the interests they officially represented. This was not, for anyone paying close attention, a surprise, but the scale and consistency of the documentation was notable, and it produced in the post-Arc period a widespread and lasting skepticism about official institutional communication that is visible in the law of every faction. Every faction in the game operates in a world where the credibility of official communication has been severely damaged. This is partly because of what the Arc revealed about pre-Arc institutions, and partly because post-Arc factions have themselves continued to demonstrate that official communication tends to serve institutional interests. The skepticism is evidence-based, and it makes the social cohesion required for any kind of collective project, including survival, harder to maintain. The law is not nostalgic for the pre-Arc information environment. The managed narrative of the pre-Arc world was not better in the sense of being more truthful, but it was more stable in the sense that it maintained shared reference points that enabled a certain kind of collective action. The post-Arc information environment is more honest in some ways, and more chaotic in all ways, and the chaos has costs that are documented in the law. The fifth thing the Arc revealed was the depth of human adaptability, and this is where the video shifts very slightly, from the accumulation of evidence for human failure towards something more complicated, because the law is not ultimately a document of pure human inadequacy. It is a document of human inadequacy in systems, and it is also a document of human capacity outside of or against those systems. The salvager communities, the improvised technical solutions, the cross-faction human connections, the young generation reading the physical environment to reconstruct their own history, the raider crews who develop complex ethical frameworks from scratch while running operations in a broken world. All of this is also in the law, and it is documented with the same even attentiveness as the structural failures. The game does not love its humans, but it also doesn't dismiss them. What Ark Raider's law suggests when you read it as completely as it can be read is not that humans are irredeemably broken. It suggests that the systems humans build tend to betray their better intentions over time, and that the human capacity that survives in the gaps between and outside of those systems is significant and real and consistently undervalued. The problem is not human nature. The problem is human systems, and specifically the tendency to build systems that concentrate power and protect that concentration at the expense of almost everything else. This is a distinction with implications. If the problem were human nature, the solution would be impossible, and the law would be simply bleak. But the law isn't simply bleak, it is complicated, and complicated suggests that the outcome is not predetermined, that the patterns can, in principle, be interrupted, that the systems that reproduce failure can, in principle, be built differently. The evidence for this is fragmentary and conditional in the law, but it is there. The Ark's revelation was not a moral lesson delivered to humanity from outside. It was the exposure of processes that were already underway. The lesson, if you want to call it that, was already available in the pre-Ark world, written in environmental contamination, data, and deferred maintenance records, and the lives of people living in abandoned population zones. The Ark just removed the option of not looking. And this is the final thing the Ark revealed, the most uncomfortable one, and the one that the entire video has been building toward. The conditions that make human civilization fragile were visible and documented before the Ark arrived. The people who needed to act on them had, in many cases, the information they needed to act. The systems that should have translated that information into action had the capacity, in theory, to act. The failure was not ignorance, it was not incapacity, it was priority. The pre-Ark world, when pushed to the point of actual choice, chose to protect what it had built over fixing what was broken. The post-Ark world, in most of its factions, is making the same choice. Protecting established hierarchies, established narratives, established distributions of resource and power, even when those established structures are demonstrably producing poor outcomes for the majority of people living inside them. This is why humans were always the real problem. Not because they are evil, not because they lack the intelligence or the capacity to do differently, but because the systems they build and the mechanisms those systems develop to protect themselves are robust enough to override the individual intentions of the people operating them. The good people inside broken systems tend to produce the system's outcomes rather than their own, and the systems are designed through long iteration to be very good at that. The Raiders sit in an uncomfortable position relative to all of this. They are outside the main faction systems in operational terms, but not independent of them. They benefit from the same resource flows the systems maintain. They enable some of the same dynamics they might otherwise critique. This is not hypocrisy exactly. It is the condition of survival in a world where the systems are all you have, even when those systems are the problem. The law of Ark Raiders does not offer a solution to this condition. It does not build toward a heroic moment where the cycle gets broken. What it does is describe the cycle with enough specificity and enough honesty that you can see it clearly. And seeing it clearly is maybe the beginning of something. Not enough by itself, but not nothing. The Ark is still out there. The machines are still falling. The underground is still organizing and fighting and surviving and reproducing the same patterns that made the surface world so brittle. And somewhere in that pattern there are people who are reading the environment, asking different questions, building things that don't quite look like what came before. The law notes their existence and does not promise them a good outcome, but it notes them. The humans were always the real problem. And the humans are also the only ones who can be the solution. Continue no matter what. 2201. Calculated word, count requirements, and planned remaining chapters. Calculated word, count requirements, and planned remaining chapters. Chapter 6. The architects of their own ruin. There is a specific category of human failure that the law of arc raiders returns to more often than any other, and it is not the failure of ignorance or the failure of malice. It is the failure of competence, the failure of people who knew exactly what they were doing, who were very good at what they were doing, and who were doing something that was destroying the foundations of the world they lived in. This chapter is about those people, the architects, the planners, the administrators, the experts who built the machine that ate itself. The pre-arc world had no shortage of intelligent people. The law makes this clear through the sophistication of the technology, the complexity of the institutional structures, and the quality of the internal documentation that survived the arc period. These were not stupid institutions run by stupid people. They were sophisticated institutions run by capable people who were operating within a set of incentives and constraints that produced catastrophic outcomes regardless of individual capability. This is an important distinction. It is easier emotionally to attribute large-scale failure to malice or stupidity. Both explanations locate the problem in a specific group of people who can be identified, blamed, and implicitly separated from the rest of humanity. If the people who built the brittle world were stupid or evil, then the people who didn't build it can feel clean. The law doesn't give you that comfort. The people who built the brittle world were, in many cases, doing exactly what competent people in their positions were supposed to do. The corporate administrators who made decisions that contributed to infrastructure degradation were in many cases making financially rational decisions. The maintenance deferral calculations that led to crumbling power grids were, from within the accounting framework they were operating in, correct. The correct calculation, applied consistently over time within a broken framework, produced the infrastructure collapse. The calculation was right. The framework was wrong. But the framework was not their job to fix. Their job was to work within it. This is how large-scale institutional failure actually works. Not through a series of visibly wrong decisions made by visibly wrong people, but through a series of locally correct decisions made by locally competent people operating within a framework that is itself the problem. The law understands this. It shows you the correct decisions and the wrong framework and the catastrophic outcome, and it does not offer a clean moral accounting. The engineers who designed and maintained the pre-arc energy infrastructure are referenced in several data logs, and the picture that emerges is complicated. Many of them identified the problems, many of them raised concerns through appropriate channels, many of them documented their concerns carefully and continued to implement the decisions they had objected to, because that is what professionals do within institutional structures. The documentation of their objections is still there in the archive data. The infrastructure failed anyway. One possible reading of this is that the individual professionals were blameless because they followed proper procedure. Another possible reading is that following proper procedure in a broken system is a form of participation in that system's outcomes. The law does not argue for either reading explicitly. It presents both and lets the tension stand. But the tension is important because it is the tension that determines how you think about accountability in the post-arc world, and the post-arc world has the same problem. The planners who designed the underground infrastructure, the ones who made decisions about which populations would have priority access to which resources, were also competent professionals. Their allocation models were sophisticated. Their risk assessments were detailed. The outcomes those models and assessments produced were deeply inequitable. The sophistication of the tool did not correct for the values built into the assumptions, and the people running the models either did not examine the assumptions or examined them and accepted them as natural constraints. Natural constraints is a phrase that appears several times in different contexts in the law data, and each time it appears, it is worth interrogating. Things that are presented as natural constraints in institutional planning are often the encoding of a prior value judgment as a technical parameter. A model that assumes certain populations are lower priority is not making a value-neutral efficiency calculation. It is implementing a value judgment about whose welfare matters less. The presentation of that judgment as a technical parameter is itself a choice. The military planners of the pre-Arch period are particularly interesting in the law. There are references to detailed strategic assessments of large-scale catastrophic risk, documents that were produced by competent military analysts doing their jobs, and that identified, with some accuracy, the kinds of systemic vulnerabilities that eventually became critical. These assessments were not wrong. They were also not acted on, because acting on them would have required a scale of investment and institutional reorganization that the existing political and economic structures were not positioned to implement. There is a specific kind of institutional frustration visible in some of these documents. The frustration of people who can see clearly what the problem is, who have described it accurately, who have proposed reasonable responses, and who have watched those proposals be absorbed into bureaucratic processes that neither implement them nor formally reject them. The proposal exists, it is filed, it is referenced in subsequent planning documents. Nothing changes. The problem it described eventually becomes an emergency. The architects of the pre-Arch world were, in many cases, aware that what they were building was fragile. The law contains enough internal assessments and technical reviews to establish this clearly. The awareness existed. What was missing was not knowledge but mechanism. There was no reliable mechanism for translating accurate knowledge of systemic risk into action at the scale the risk required. The institutions that needed to act were not structured to act on long-term systemic threats. They were structured to act on immediate, competitive pressures. This is one of the most precise things the law says about the pre-Arch world's failure mode. Not that it didn't know, not that it didn't have capable people, but that its institutions were optimized for a specific type of problem solving, the immediate competitive problem, and were systematically poor at the type of problem that required long-term, collective, non-competitive action. The skills of the architects were real. The institutional structures they operated within were not designed for the problems that mattered most. The post-Arch factions have inherited versions of the same problem. The most effective factions, in terms of short-term operational performance, are the ones with clear hierarchies, fast decision-making, and strong competitive incentives. These are also, the law suggests, the factions most likely to reproduce the pre-Arch failure pattern on a smaller scale, optimizing for immediate competitive advantage, deferring long-term systemic costs, and building structures that are efficient in the short term and brittle over time. The factions that attempt more distributed decision-making and longer-term thinking tend to be less operationally sharp in the immediate term. They are slower to respond. Their internal disagreements consume resources. Their resource allocation is less optimal by narrow efficiency measures. But the law hints that they also tend to be more resilient to the specific failure modes that brought down the pre-Arch world. They have less to lose when the short-term optimization framework breaks down, because they were never fully committed to it. One of the planners whose records appear in the game data is a pre-Arch infrastructure administrator whose documentation spans the last decade before the Arch event. Reading through the available fragments of their records is one of the more disquieting experiences the law offers. This person was clearly intelligent, clearly aware of the infrastructure problems, clearly making responsible professional assessments, and clearly operating within constraints that made implementing those assessments practically impossible. Their final pre-Arch record, a maintenance assessment filed approximately 8 months before the first arc strike, describes the power grid in their region as carrying risk of cascading failure under stress. It recommends a significant capital investment program, a timeline of approximately 3 years, and a temporary reduction in commercial power draw to allow for infrastructure rehabilitation. The record indicates this assessment was received, acknowledged, and filed. There is no follow-up record of action taken on the primary recommendations. What happens to this administrator after the ARC is not documented. Their records end with the ARC event, but the infrastructure they described as critically vulnerable failed in ways consistent with their assessment. The cascade failure they predicted happened, and the record of their prediction is still there in the archive alongside the record of the failure. The gap between the warning and the response is visible and measurable. The architects who built the post-ARC underground infrastructure are a different generation with a different set of constraints, and the law treats them with appropriate complexity. They were not building under normal conditions. They were building under emergency conditions with limited materials, limited time, and limited information. The quality of some of the early post-ARC construction reflects this. It was done quickly, out of necessity, and not always correctly. What is interesting is how the mistakes of that early construction have become load-bearing problems in the present. Underground spaces that were built with structural compromises are now too embedded in the larger infrastructure to easily replace. Systems that were connected with improvised solutions during the emergency have become permanent, because disconnecting them would require a level of resource commitment that cannot be sustained while the ARC is still active. The temporary solutions are now the permanent reality. This is the architecture of the post-ARC world, a layer of emergency decisions made under extreme pressure, on top of a layer of pre-ARC infrastructure maintained well below optimal, built from materials that were themselves already compromised by environmental damage. Every structural choice anyone makes in this world is made within constraints that were determined by someone else's decisions at an earlier point. No one is building on clean ground. The technical experts in the post-ARC world face a particular version of the architect's dilemma. They have the expertise to identify what is wrong with the systems they are maintaining. They often lack the resources to fix it correctly. And the systems they are maintaining are critical enough that they cannot simply be shut down for proper rehabilitation. So the choices are between inadequate solutions that keep things running and correct solutions that can't currently be implemented. Most of the time, the inadequate solution wins. The law documents this not as a moral failure, but as a resource constraint. But the cumulative effect of inadequate solutions, applied repeatedly across multiple systems over time, is a slow accumulation of technical debt that makes each subsequent crisis slightly worse and each subsequent solution slightly more difficult to implement. The spiral is visible in the data if you read the maintenance records in sequence. There are faction technicians in the law who are clearly aware of this spiral. Some of them are frustrated by it. Some have made a kind of peace with it, focusing on managing the immediate problem in front of them without projecting forward to the downstream implications. The law doesn't judge either response. Both are understandable given the conditions. But the contrast between the two orientations produces different kinds of outcomes over time. The architects of the post-ARC surveillance and communication infrastructure are worth particular attention. These systems were built quickly, in many cases by people with the best immediate intentions, and they were built in ways that concentrated information control in specific hands. The people who built them were not necessarily thinking about long-term power dynamics. They were thinking about operational efficiency and survival, but the systems they built have properties that make certain power structures easier to maintain and others harder. Information asymmetry, the condition in which some people know more than others about critical systems and events, is one of the most reliable generators of structural power. The people who built the post-arc communication infrastructure created information asymmetries as a byproduct of technical decisions. Those asymmetries are now structural features of the post-arc world, as difficult to remove as the compromised load-bearing structures underground. The law shows a few instances of architects who deliberately tried to build differently. People who, having seen what the pre-arc world's technical infrastructure produced, tried to design post-arc systems with different properties. More distributed, more transparent, more resistant to capture by specific interests. The results are, to varying degrees, partial. Some of the design intentions held, others were modified or defeated by the operational pressures of the post-arc environment. One community in the law built a water system that was designed to be comprehensible and maintainable by any community member with basic technical orientation, rather than dependent on a small number of trained specialists. The design goal was deliberate redundancy. No single person's expertise was essential, so the system could not be held hostage by the departure or capture of key technical staff. The system worked as designed for a while. Then the community came under resource pressure, and the redundancy was reduced to free up labour for other purposes. The original design intention exists in the record. The current operating configuration is different. This is the pattern. Good architectural intentions encountering the pressures of operational reality and being modified in the direction of the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance in a world structured by scarcity and competitive pressure tends to lead toward concentration, simplification, and the replacement of resilient but complex systems with efficient but brittle ones. This is what the architects of the pre-arc world chose over and over, and it is what the architects of the post-arc world are choosing under different circumstances for the same reasons. The game does not offer an architect who gets it right. Not completely. There are people who make better choices and worse choices. There are designs that are more resilient and less resilient. But the perfect architectural solution, the system that is genuinely robust against the pressures that destroyed the pre-arc world, does not appear in the law. This is either honest pessimism or a recognition that such systems, if they exist, are built over long time spans and are not visible within the game's current timeline. What the law does show is that the awareness of the problem is present. The architects of the post-arc world, the good ones, know what happened to the pre-arc world. They have the physical evidence of its failure all around them. They are building with the ruins of its mistakes as their material. The knowledge of what went wrong is more widely distributed than it was in the pre-arc period, when institutional narrative management kept many of the worst technical assessments from circulating broadly. Whether this wider distribution of knowledge translates into better architectural choices is the open question. Knowledge without the institutional capacity to act on it does not automatically produce different outcomes. The pre-arc world had the knowledge. What it lacked was the institutional structure, or the political will, or the material incentive to act on it at the required scale. The post-arc world has more knowledge, more distributed. Whether it has better structured institutions or different incentives is less clear. The architects of ruin are not special monsters. They are competent people operating within systems that produce ruinous outcomes. They are the people who keep things running, while the things that need to change don't change. They are, in a sense, the load-bearing elements of the system's continuity, the ones whose competence makes it possible to defer the reckoning long enough that when it finally comes, it is catastrophic rather than correctable. And the uncomfortable final note of this chapter is that the architects of ruin are not over. They are still at work in the post-arc world, the maintenance cycles that defer rather than fix, the allocation models that encode inequity as technical parameters, the communication systems that concentrate information as a byproduct of efficiency design, the structural decisions that sacrifice resilience for operational performance. The architects are still drawing plans, the foundations they are building on are still compromised, and the arc is still out there, applying pressure. Chapter 7. The weapons. We pointed at each other. There is a kind of violence in the law of arc raiders that is not dramatic. It is not the violence of arc combat, which the game renders kinetically and with obvious design investment. It is the quiet violence of institutional decision-making, the violence of allocation choices, the violence of enforcement systems, the violence of the gap between what is owed to people and what they receive. This chapter is about how humans weaponized almost everything they built, including the things that were not supposed to be weapons. The pre-arc world's formal weapons, the ones built specifically for kinetic violence, are well documented in the law. The weapons development programs of the major pre-arc powers were substantial, sophisticated, and globally distributed. The game's salvage economy is built in significant part on the material legacy of those programs, but the formal weapons are the obvious category. What the law rewards attention to is the informal categories, the things that functioned as weapons without being classified as such, economic systems as weapons. The law documents with clinical precision how pre-arc economic arrangements function to extract value from the most vulnerable populations and transfer it upward through structures of debt, labour obligation, and resource dependency. These arrangements were legal. They were bureaucratically managed. They produced consistent, predictable outcomes that systematically harmed specific groups. They were also, by any reasonable definition, forms of organised harm. The absence of obvious violence in their operation did not make them non-violent in their effects. The post-arc factions that operate resource markets are, in many cases, running the same basic mechanism with different branding. The law shows debt relationships, labour obligations, and resource dependencies being used to maintain structural advantages in every faction that has achieved significant scale. The vocabulary is different. The mechanism is the same. Resources flow from people with less leverage to people with more leverage, and the gap widens over time unless something intervenes to reverse it. There are raider logs that document specific instances of being caught between these systems. Operations where the nominal payment for a contract was technically adequate, but the obligations attached to the contract, the exclusivity clauses, the equipment requirements, the insurance and bonding demands reduced the actual return to something much less. The total structure was designed to ensure that the raiders remained dependent on the faction system rather than accumulating enough resources to operate independently. This is not accidental. It is architectural. Information as a weapon is another category the law explores carefully. The pre-arc world built surveillance infrastructure at a scale that was, in retrospect, clearly beyond what communication or security needs alone required. The density of monitoring systems in pre-arc commercial and residential zones, the data retention policies, the analytical capabilities built into the monitoring networks, all of these were investments in information asymmetry, in the capacity to know more about people than they knew about the institutions monitoring them. In a negotiation, in a dispute, in a labour relation, in a resource allocation decision, the party with more information has a structural advantage. The pre-arc surveillance infrastructure was an investment in that advantage at a civilizational scale. The people building it called it security infrastructure, or quality assurance, or network management. But the operational effect was to give institutional actors a systematic information advantage over the individuals within their systems. The post-arc factions that inherited usable fragments of this surveillance infrastructure have not dismantled it. Several of them have extended it within the limits of their operational capacity. The same argument applies. Knowing more about your population than they know about you is a form of power, and power, once available, tends to be used. The law documents the use and does not dramatize it. It is simply part of how the larger factions operate. Legal systems as weapons is a category the law approaches somewhat obliquely, because formal legal systems are largely absent in the post-Arch world, but their functional equivalents are present. Every faction has some form of internal dispute resolution, some form of rules enforcement, some form of defining which behaviours are permissible and which are subject to sanction. These systems function like legal systems in their effects, and the law shows them functioning like the pre-Arch legal system in their patterns, more flexible and more favourable for those with more resources and connections, more rigid and less favourable for those without. There is a faction administrative record that documents 2 disciplinary cases involving similar violations with very different outcomes. The first involves a senior logistics officer who misappropriated resources for personal use. The outcome is a formal reprimand, a temporary reduction in operational authority, and a repayment agreement structured over 3 years. The second involves a lower-ranking supply worker who misappropriated a smaller quantity of resources. The outcome is immediate termination of faction membership and exclusion from faction-controlled resources. The log does not comment on the disparity. It records both outcomes in the same administrative format with the same bureaucratic neutrality, but the disparity is clearly visible to anyone reading both entries. The person with more institutional position received a proportionally much smaller sanction for a proportionally larger violation. This is not an anomaly in the law. It is a pattern. And it is the same pattern that characterized pre-Arch legal systems, where the capacity of the legal system to protect you was substantially correlated with your ability to pay for legal services. Medical systems as weapons is perhaps the most viscerally uncomfortable category in the law. Healthcare as a mechanism of control, where access to medical treatment is used as leverage to extract labour, loyalty or compliance, appears in the records of multiple factions. Not all of them, not uniformly, but often enough to constitute a pattern. The faction that controls the best medical facilities in a given underground region controls a very powerful inducement. The law shows people making decisions they would not otherwise make, because the alternative is losing access to medical care for themselves or their dependents. These decisions benefit the factions making the offer. The people making the decisions are not free agents exercising meaningful choices. They are operating under conditions of coercive dependency, and the term coercive is the right one, even though the transaction is framed voluntarily. The voluntariness of a choice made under conditions of life-threatening need is a philosophical problem the pre-Arch world also never resolved. Physical infrastructure as a weapon is documented in the law through the practice of controlled access. The underground spaces of the game are not uniformly accessible. Certain corridors, certain facilities, certain areas are controlled by factions, and access is conditioned on affiliation, payment, or compliance. Control of physical space is control of movement. And control of movement is a form of power that can be wielded precisely and continuously without ever requiring a dramatic act of force. The people who built the underground access control systems in the early post-Arch period made choices about where to put gates and what the conditions for passing through them would be. Those choices are now structural features of the world. The geography of control was built into the architecture. Changing it would require physical reconstruction and the willingness to absorb the political conflict that comes with dismantling an established access control system. Neither is readily available, so the system persists and continues to function as designed. Knowledge as a weapon is different from information surveillance, though related. The law documents the deliberate restriction of technical knowledge in several contexts. Factions that control particular technical expertise maintain that expertise as a proprietary advantage by limiting its distribution. Training is provided only within faction structures and comes with affiliation obligations. Technical documentation is treated as classified. The people who need the knowledge to survive are made dependent on the factions that possess it. This is not dramatically different from how professional knowledge worked in the pre-Arch world, where credentials and professional associations managed the distribution of technical knowledge and the financial returns associated with it. The mechanism is the same. The stakes are different. In the pre-Arch world, a person without access to licensed medical knowledge might pay more for healthcare. In the post-Arch world, a community without access to critical technical knowledge might not survive a system's failure. The raider's position in relation to all these weapon systems is characteristically uncomfortable. They are not outside them. They use information asymmetry in their operations. They benefit from access control in some areas. They work within and for faction systems that use economic coercion. The law does not position the raiders as morally clean. What it positions them as is more aware of the systems they are operating within, without that awareness necessarily translating into fundamentally different behaviour. There is one raider-associated record that is particularly striking in this context. It is a debriefing log following an operation where the raider crew was contracted by a faction to recover specific technical documentation from a pre-Arch archive. The documentation recovered turned out to include, among other things, detailed records of how the faction's own pre-Arch predecessor organisation had used surveillance data to suppress labour organising. The faction received the documentation as contracted. The raider crew's debriefing note contains a single line of observation about the irony of the situation. Then the operation is marked complete. That single line of observation is doing a lot of work. It acknowledges the thing that was seen. It doesn't change the outcome. The documentation was delivered. The contract was fulfilled. The system of which both the raiders and the faction are parts continued operating. The awareness existed. The awareness was insufficient to change anything. This is one of the most compressed statements in the law about the relationship between knowing and doing. The Arch itself, as a weapon system, is the most obvious weapon in the game's world. But the law suggests that the relationship between humans and weapons preceded the Arch by a long margin and was not primarily about the Arch. The weapons humans pointed at each other. The economic systems, the information systems, the access control systems, the medical leverage systems, the knowledge restriction systems were already sophisticated and operational long before the first Arch signal. The Arch added a new weapon to a world that was already heavily armed against itself. What the Arch's arrival revealed in the domain of weapons was how much of the weaponry humans had built was pointed inward. The surveillance infrastructure was monitoring citizens, not foreign threats primarily. The economic coercion systems were extracting from domestic populations. The access control systems were managing internal populations. The knowledge restrictions were maintaining competitive advantages within societies, not across them. The world had built an extraordinary arsenal, and a significant portion of it was aimed at the people living inside the civilization it was supposed to protect. The post-Arch world has not changed this orientation in any fundamental way. The weapons, formal and informal, are still pointed in the same directions they were before, adjusted for the smaller scale and different geography of the underground world. Factions fight each other? Yes, but the most consistent application of the weapon systems documented in the law is toward the management and control of the populations within each faction's own sphere of influence. This is perhaps the most bleak single observation in the entire law dataset. Not that humans fight each other, that is old news, but that the most sophisticated and most consistently deployed weapon systems in human civilization are the ones pointed at ordinary people trying to live their lives within the systems that claim to protect them. The Arch is an external threat. The systems are an internal one, and the internal one was there first. Resistance to the internal weapon systems is documented in the law, and it is scattered and partial, and usually very local. A community that refuses a particular faction's access control terms. A technical group that distributes documentation openly in defiance of faction knowledge restriction policies. A raider crew that gives a copy of important operational intelligence to an unaffiliated survivor group that couldn't have paid for it. These are small acts. The law notes them without inflating their significance, but it does note them, and the noting matters. The law of Arch raiders, in the aggregate, is a document of systems and the people who live inside them, and it is attentive to the possibility that people can act, in small ways, against the systems that contain them. Not reliably, not transformatively, but real and documented acts of refusal and redistribution and sharing in a world where every major system incentivizes the opposite. Whether these small acts accumulate into anything significant is something the law doesn't resolve. The systems are robust. The small acts are, individually, small. The gap between them is not closed by anything visible in the current game's law, but the gap is the space where the possibility of something different lives, and the law knows it is there, even if it can't tell you what grows there. The weapons we pointed at each other were built over a long time, refined over many generations, and optimized to be difficult to recognize as weapons by the people they were pointed at. They were presented as infrastructure, as services, as security systems, as normal features of how a complex civilization operates. The Ark stripped away the complexity and the normalization and left the structures exposed. And what the structures look like, naked, is what they always were. Instruments of control built by some humans, pointed at others, maintained by the competence of the architects who believed they were just doing their jobs. Chapter 8. The silence in the archives. There is a specific kind of evidence in the Arch Raiders law that is not data. It is the absence of data, the gaps in the archives, the records that should exist and don't, the silence where documentation should be. This chapter is about what that silence tells you and why the deliberate management of what is preserved and what disappears is itself a form of human action with consequences. Every archive is a set of choices: what to keep, what to discard, what to preserve in what form, and who has access to what is preserved. These choices are never neutral. They reflect the priorities and the interests of the people and institutions making them. In the pre-Arch world, archive management was a significant institutional function, and the patterns of what was preserved and what was not, visible through the gaps in the surviving record, are themselves a kind of evidence. The most complete records in the game's lore tend to be financial and operational records. Asset inventories, budget allocations, operational logs, performance metrics. These were kept with care and in multiple copies. They were backed up on redundant systems. They were considered essential institutional knowledge and treated accordingly. Their survival rate through the Arch period is high. The records that are consistently less complete, that show more gaps and more apparent deliberate redaction, are human impact assessments. Records of what institutional decisions meant for the people affected by them. Medical outcome data correlated with socioeconomic status, documentation of complaints and grievances, and their resolution or non-resolution. Records of the communities that were designated as unviable for commercial activity and then simply dropped from subsequent documentation. This pattern is not subtle, but it is also not the result of a single decision or a conspiracy. It is the accumulated effect of many individual decisions about what is worth preserving, made by people who were trained to think of certain kinds of data as important and other kinds as secondary. The financial and operational records were considered the real record, the thing that actually tracked what happened. The human impact data was considered context, or supplementary, or sensitive in ways that made preservation complicated. What survives in the archive is what was considered worth preserving. And what was considered worth preserving reflects a specific theory of value, one in which the operational functioning of institutions is more real and more important than the human experiences those institutions produce. The silence about human experience is not just an absence, it is a statement. The post-arc factions have inherited this archival philosophy along with everything else. Their records are operationally detailed and humanly thin. There are meticulous logs of resource flow and very sparse logs of what it was like to be a person receiving or not receiving those resources. The measurement systems that exist are good at measuring institutional performance by institutional metrics and poor at measuring anything that those metrics don't capture. There are exceptions. The raider-associated archives tend to have more individual voice than faction-controlled archives. This is partly a function of who is doing the recording. Individual raiders writing operational notes tend to include personal observations and interpersonal context that institutional record-keeping excludes. The texture of individual experience is more present in those documents than in faction administrative records. But the raider archives are also smaller, less complete, and less organized than faction archives. They capture the human texture of events, but not the systematic overview. The faction archives have the systematic overview, but not the human texture. The truth of what happened in the post-arc world is distributed between these two incomplete record sets in a way that makes any single comprehensive account impossible. This is not an accident of circumstance. It is a structural feature of who controls record-keeping infrastructure. The factions with the most resources have the most sophisticated archival systems. Those systems reflect faction priorities. The people with fewer resources, whose lives are captured more fully in individual accounts, don't have the organizational capacity to maintain institutional quality records. The distribution of archival capacity maps onto the distribution of power, and the resulting archive is shaped by that mapping. There are records in the game that have clearly been redacted. Not sophisticated digital redaction. More often simple removal, sections of documents where the data simply ends or where there are references to attached materials that are no longer attached. The redactions are not explained. They are just there, visible as gaps in the record. And the patterns of the gaps are informative. The most consistently redacted materials across multiple archive sources concern specific events in the early post-arc period. The first few years after the arc's arrival are the least documented period in the game's lore, despite being the most consequential for understanding how the current world came to be structured as it is. This is suspicious, not in a conspiracy theory sense, but in the ordinary sense that when the documentation of a consequential period is unusually sparse, the most likely explanation is that the documentation was managed. What happened in the early post-arc period that would have required documentation management? The lore provides enough context to make some educated inferences. The decisions about who got access to the best shelter were made then. The initial faction structures were established then. The first allocations of salvaged pre-arc technology were made then. These were the founding decisions of the post-arc world, and who benefits from those decisions being clearly documented versus obscured is not a difficult question to answer. The people who benefited from those early allocation decisions are, in many cases, the people now running the factions that control the archives. This is not presented in the lore as a revelation, it is presented as context. But the implication is clear, and the lore is careful enough to make sure the implication is visible. Community-held oral history is another form of archive in the game's world, and the lore treats it with some complexity. Oral traditions preserve things that written records don't, particularly the emotional and relational texture of events. They are also more variable across retellings, more influenced by the community's present concerns in how they frame past events, and less useful for establishing specific details with confidence. The oral archive and the written archive preserve different things and have different failure modes. There are characters in the game whose knowledge of pre-arc and early post-arc events comes primarily from oral transmission. Their accounts contain details that are not in any written archive. Some of these details are probably accurate. Some are probably distorted by the telephone effect of repeated retelling. Some may be the result of deliberate narrative shaping within communities that wanted to preserve a particular version of their own history. What is interesting is that the oral accounts and the written accounts sometimes directly contradict each other on specific points, not ambiguously, not in ways that could be explained by perspective differences, but in ways that require one or the other to be inaccurate. The law does not adjudicate these contradictions. It presents both versions and lets the player decide which to credit and on what grounds. This is unusual for a game's law. Most game law establishes a definitive factual record, with alternative accounts being clearly labelled as unreliable. Arc Raiders leaves the contradictions open. The official record and the community memory are both potentially distorted. Both preserve things, the other doesn't. Neither is the complete truth. The player is in the same position as any historian working with incomplete and interested sources. The silence in the archives about certain specific people is worth noting. There are references in multiple sources to individuals who appear to have been significant actors in the early post-arc period and who are then simply absent from subsequent documentation. Not killed or not documented as killed, just absent. People who are important enough to be referenced in passing by multiple sources and then apparently cease to exist as far as the archival record is concerned. One possible reading is that these are simply people who died in undocumented circumstances, which is not uncommon in the post-arc period. Another reading is that their absence from the record is itself managed, that they were significant enough to constitute a problem for whatever narrative the surviving archives are built around, and that their absence is a product of that significance, rather than of simple mortality. The law is not explicit about this. It provides the references and the subsequent silence and leaves the interpretation open. But the pattern of these specific absences, the kinds of actors who disappear, the kinds of events they were associated with, is consistent with the reading that they were inconvenient to the dominant narrative and were managed out of the record. Technical knowledge in the archives is its own category. There is a significant amount of pre-arc technical documentation that survives in recoverable form, but it is not uniformly accessible. The factions that control major archive nodes control access to that technical knowledge. There are references in the law to specific pieces of technical information being held back from general circulation, not because they are dangerous in a weapons sense, but because they represent operational advantages. A faction that controls knowledge of a particular power, relay repair technique, controls that technique as a resource. The people who need the technique and don't have access to it are structurally dependent on the faction that does. This is the knowledge restriction as weapon mechanism operating through archival control rather than overt monopoly. The archive is the instrument. Access policy is the weapon. The game's salvage missions, where players recover data from pre-arc and early post-arc sources, are in part an archival project. You're recovering lost records and bringing them into whatever information ecosystem you're connected to. The law around these missions is careful to note that the value of recovered information is not just in what it contains, but in who gets access to it. The same recovered record can be a public resource or a private advantage depending on where it ends up. There is a running tension in raider culture, visible in multiple log entries and NPC conversations about what to do with recovered information. Faction contracts usually include provisions about information discovered during operations being treated as proprietary to the contracting faction. These provisions are enforceable. They are also, according to some raiders, deeply problematic in specific cases where the recovered information clearly affects people outside the contracting faction's membership. The ethics of information brokerage in a world where information is a survival resource is not resolved in the law. Different characters hold different positions. Some raiders take the contract provisions as absolute. Others make private decisions to share specific pieces of information outside the contracted relationship. The law notes both behaviours without endorsing either fully. The tension is real and ongoing. The silence in the archives is also present in a different sense in the physical environment. The parts of the underground that have been sealed, the sections that are never mapped, the corridors that are marked with hazard indicators, but no explanation of the hazard. These are physical silences, things that happened in those spaces that are not documented anywhere accessible. The absence of documentation is itself evidence of something having happened. Raiders who have worked near these sealed sections long enough report a consistent pattern in the hazard indicators. The types of hazard marks do not always correspond to the types of contamination or structural damage you would expect from arc activity alone. Some of the indicators suggest events that predate the arc. Some suggest human origin hazards. The physical silence of the sealed sections points toward events that someone, at some point, decided not to document in accessible records. The conclusion this chapter builds toward is simple, but uncomfortable. The archive of the Arc Raiders world is not a neutral repository of what happened. It is a political artifact. It reflects who had the power and the resources to preserve what they wanted preserved and to manage what they wanted managed. The silence in it is not the absence of events, it is the presence of choices, and those choices were made by the same humans who made all the other choices documented throughout this video. Understanding the law of Arc Raiders means understanding what is in the record and what is not, and understanding that both are informative. The gaps are evidence, the silences are testimony. The absent records tell a story that the surviving records were selected not to tell. And reading between the lines of what survives, against the background of what should be there and isn't, gives you the most complete picture available of what actually happened and why. Chapter 9. The War Before the War. Almost everything in the lore of Arc Raiders is about the Ark, the machines, the invasion, the survival imperative that reshapes every human decision. But there is another war in this world, running underneath and alongside the Ark conflict, and it was happening long before the Ark arrived, and it is still happening now. It is the war between humans over the terms of survival, over who gets to define what survival means, over who gets to be inside the definition and who gets left out. This chapter is about that war, which is the older war, and the one that has killed more people over a longer period than the Ark has. The pre-Ark world was not at peace. This is stated plainly in the law and is worth sitting with for a moment. The decades preceding the Ark event included multiple large-scale violent conflicts. The law does not catalogue them in detail, but the references are consistent enough to establish a picture of a world in which organised violence between human groups was a regular feature of the political landscape. The Ark did not introduce war into the human world. It inherited a world that already had it. The causes of pre-Ark conflicts are referenced in law sources with a consistent pattern: resource access, territorial control, and political authority. These are ancient motivators. The pre-Ark world fought over energy reserves, water rights, trade routes, and the authority to make decisions about those things. The sophistication of the technology involved was greater than in earlier historical periods. The underlying motivators were the same. What changed with the Ark is not the fact of human violence, but the orientation of it. The Ark created conditions in which, at least rhetorically, human conflict became secondary to the shared threat. Faction narratives in the post-Arc world consistently invoke the Arc as a reason why internal conflicts need to be managed, why faction unity needs to be maintained, why the violence humans do to each other needs to be subordinated to the collective survival project. The Arc, ironically, provides cover for exactly the kinds of internal control mechanisms that the pre-Arc world built and deployed against its own populations. But the war before the war doesn't go away when you give it a rhetorical frame. It continues under the surface of every faction structure. It is present in every resource allocation decision that advantages one group over another. It is present in every enforcement action that falls harder on the less powerful. It is present in every archive management decision that makes certain histories more visible than others. The violence is different in form, often non-kinetic, but it is consistent in its direction. The faction conflicts in the game are real kinetic conflicts. Factions do fight each other with weapons. People die in these conflicts. The law documents them as significant events with real consequences. But the law also consistently shows that the outcomes of these conflicts tend to reconfigure the same basic distribution of power rather than fundamentally changing it. The faction that wins a territorial conflict gains resources and leverage. The people who are at the bottom of the losing faction's hierarchy end up at the bottom of the winning faction's hierarchy, with a different flag. This is not always the case. The law shows some faction conflicts, producing genuine changes in how specific communities are organized and governed. But these are the exception. The majority of documented faction conflicts produce power reconfiguration at the top of existing hierarchies rather than structural change in how those hierarchies function. The war before the war produces winners and losers within a stable framework rather than changing the framework. The raiders are structurally a product of the war before the war. They exist because the major factions compete with each other, and that competition creates needs for independent operators who can move between faction spheres without being fully committed to any. The competition is the conditions of their employment. A world where the factions fully cooperated would have much less need for raiders as a category. The ongoing war before the war is the economic foundation of raider existence. This gives the raiders a complicated relationship to faction, peace, and faction conflict. A reduction in inter-faction conflict would be, on its face, better for the survival of everyone in the underground world. It would also make the specific niche that raiders occupy less commercially viable. There are raider logs that are self-aware about this dynamic, and the self-awareness produces some uncomfortable reflections. The system that exploits you is also the system that employs you, and disentangling those two relationships is not simple. Human violence against the Ark is the one form of organized violence in the game world that the law presents as straightforwardly justified. The Ark is a genuine external threat. Defending against it is a genuine survival necessity, but even here, the law adds complexity. The defense posture against the Ark is also used to justify resource allocation patterns, access restrictions, and social control mechanisms that serve factional interests. The genuine security necessity becomes the cover for a broader set of control functions. There is a particular kind of security theatre documented in the law, where faction-controlled defensive operations against Ark incursions are organised in ways that also manage internal population movement, restrict access to certain areas, and maintain information control under the guise of operational security. The Ark threat is real. The operational security rationale for certain specific restrictions is not. Both coexist in the same administrative framework. The pre-Ark world did this too. The law references security and anti-terrorism frameworks being used to justify surveillance systems, population management tools, and information restriction practices that served institutional interests beyond their stated security purposes. The security function and the control function were intertwined to the point of inseparability. Post-Arc factions have inherited both the intertwining and the inseparability. What the war before the war most clearly represents in the law is the continuity of the pre-Arc power structure's basic logic across the discontinuity of the Arc event. The Arc is a massive disruption. It destroyed enormous amounts of physical infrastructure, killed a significant portion of the population, and reorganized the geography of human habitation. But it did not disrupt the basic logic of the war before the war. That logic, the competition for control over the terms of survival, kept operating through the Arc event and emerged on the other side with the same structure, adjusted for new conditions. This is the most direct statement of the video's central argument, and it is worth pausing on. The humans were always the real problem because the problem that most consistently threatens human welfare in Arcraiders' world is not the Arc. It is the ongoing war between humans over the terms of survival, which operates through violence sometimes, through economic systems more often, through information management constantly, and through the simple friction of powerful groups protecting their advantages at the expense of less powerful groups, always. The Arc is dangerous, it kills people, it destroys infrastructure, but the war before the war has been running longer, affecting more people, and producing more consistent harm over a longer period. And unlike the Arc, which is an external threat that did not choose to arrive, the war before the war is a human production. It was built. It is maintained. It could in principle be otherwise. Whether it can actually be otherwise in the world of Arc Raiders is something the law treats as genuinely uncertain. There are moments in the record where something different seemed possible, where the immediate pressure of Arc threat pushed groups toward genuine cooperation that crossed normal lines of faction competition. Some of those moments are documented with something that reads like nostalgia. Not for a golden age that existed, but for a version of human cooperation that briefly, imperfectly, appeared and then was rationalized away as the immediate pressure receded. The fact that genuine cross-faction cooperation has happened, even briefly, even partially, is itself important data. It means it is not impossible. It means the conditions under which it occurs are identifiable. Whether those conditions can be reproduced deliberately, rather than just arising under sufficient external pressure, is one of the open questions in the law. The answer would matter enormously for everything else. The violence that humans do to each other in Arc Raiders is not presented as natural or inevitable. It is presented as produced by specific conditions, by specific incentive structures, by specific institutional frameworks that make certain behaviours rational and reward them accordingly. The people engaging in that violence are not simply violent by nature. They are responding to conditions that make violence a rational choice, or conditions that make the informal violence of economic and information systems the available tool for what they need to accomplish. This framing does not excuse or dismiss the harm that violence does. The law is clear-eyed about consequences, but it does locate the problem accurately. Individual violent actors are not the root problem in a world where the conditions for violence are systematically produced and maintained. The root problem is the conditions, and the conditions are made by humans, by the architects, by the faction leaders, by the administrators making locally rational decisions within a globally broken framework. The war before the war will not end when the Arc ends, if the Arc ever ends. This is one of the darkest implications of the law, stated without being stated directly. The humans who survived the Arc and built their underground world carried the war before the war with them and rebuilt it in new terrain. A world without the Arc would still be a world with the same competition over the terms of survival, the same allocation of who is inside and who is outside the protection of civilization's institutions, the same management of information and control of resources in the service of specific interests. What ending the arc would do is remove the one factor that currently provides rhetorical cover for the war before the war. Without the arc, the internal violence of faction systems would be harder to justify as emergency measures. The ongoing control functions would be more visible as control functions rather than survival necessities. Whether that increased visibility would produce changes in behaviour or just more sophisticated justifications for the same behaviour is the question. The law doesn't answer it. It probably can't. The answer depends on choices that haven't been made yet, in a world that is still being built. The war before the war is still running. The people fighting it are still mostly calling it something else, and the arc is still falling, providing just enough genuine external threat to make the question of what the war is really about, one that most people don't have the time or the safety to ask. Chapter 10. The moment. No one remembers the same way. There is a specific event in the Ark Raiders lore that is referenced across multiple sources from multiple perspectives, and no two accounts agree on the significant details. This chapter is about that event, which the lore suggests was a critical early decision point in the post-Ark period that shaped much of what followed. It is also about what the existence of multiple contradictory accounts of the same event tells you about the nature of history in Ark Raiders' world, and, by implication, in any world. The event in question, referred to differently in different sources, involves a critical decision made in one of the major underground habitation nodes in the earliest period following the Ark's first major strikes. The decision concerned who would be admitted to the node's protected infrastructure during a period when it was at capacity and external conditions were deteriorating. How that decision was made, by whom, on what basis, and with what explicit reasoning is the subject of the contradictory accounts. The version preserved in the administrative records of the faction that currently controls the node describes a careful, rational process. A committee convened. Criteria were established. The criteria prioritized medical status, then technical skill sets required for node maintenance, then age in favor of youth. The process was documented. The committee members are named. The outcome is described as resulting from the application of established criteria consistently and without bias. The version preserved in the oral history of a community that is currently not affiliated with that faction describes something quite different. According to the oral account, the decision process was rapid, informal, and heavily influenced by prior personal and professional relationships between the committee members and the people seeking admission. People with existing connections to the decision makers were admitted. People without those connections were turned away, regardless of their medical status or technical skills. A third account, found in a recovered personal log from someone who appears to have been present during the process, describes elements consistent with both of the above accounts. There was a formal process. The formal process was also influenced by relationships and prior affiliations. Both things were true simultaneously, and the formal process provided a structure within which the relationship-based decisions could be made while appearing to follow established criteria. This is the most plausible reading, and possibly the most damning, because it describes not simple corruption, but something more systemic. Not the violation of a fair process by bad actors, but a process that was formally fair and operationally unfair, where the formal fairness served to legitimize outcomes that the formal criteria alone would not have produced. The process was real, and the bias was real, and they coexisted in the same decisions. What happened to the people who were not admitted to the node during that period is documented in scattered and incomplete ways. Some survived through other means. Some joined the faction structure that was forming around the node, but in a lower tier status, with different access than those admitted in the primary period. Some did not survive. The differential outcomes are documented. The connection between those outcomes and the decision process is not made explicitly anywhere in the official record. The current faction that controls this node uses the founding story of the early admission decisions as a key element of its legitimizing narrative. The story emphasizes the rationality and fairness of the process, the competence of the founding committee, and the careful stewardship of limited resources under emergency conditions. The founding story is told to new members as part of orientation. It is displayed in summary form in public-facing areas of the node. The oral history version of the event circulates outside the faction's controlled territory. People who carry that version are aware that the official account exists and differs from their account. The divergence is not secret, it is just also not part of the faction's internal discourse. The official version is what the faction tells itself. The oral version is what gets told somewhere else. This specific situation, the divergence between official history and community memory, is replicated in multiple contexts throughout the lore. The Ark Raiders world is a world of competing histories, where the official records and the remembered traditions often tell different stories about the same events, and where the power to control which version is most widely circulated and most formally legitimized maps closely onto other forms of power. What this means for anyone trying to understand what actually happened in the post-Ark period is that you are always working with interested sources. There are no neutral archives, there are no fully credible witnesses. There are competing accounts with different things to protect and different things to preserve. The best available approach is to read widely, to note the patterns in the contradictions, and to ask what each version is motivated to say and what each version is motivated not to say. The raider practice of recovering multiple source types for any given event or decision, which is reflected in the operational logs, is in part a response to this epistemic situation. Raiders who have been working in the field long enough learn that single source understanding is always provisional. The second and third accounts of an event are not redundant. They are how you triangulate towards something that might be less wrong than any single account. This is not the same as relativism. Not all accounts are equally credible. Accounts that are internally consistent, that align with physical evidence, that are not clearly self-serving, are more credible than accounts that are internally inconsistent, contradict physical evidence, or neatly serve the interests of the account giver. But credibility is relative, not absolute, in the Ark Raiders lore. And the most powerful actors tend to have the most access to the tools that create apparent credibility, not because they are more truthful, but because they control the infrastructures of documentation. The moment no one remembers the same way is not an isolated event. It is a type. The lore contains multiple events of this type, consequential decisions made in circumstances of limited information and high pressure, where the accounts diverge significantly and the reconstruction of what actually happened is genuinely difficult. The existence of this type as a recurring feature of the lore says something about what kind of world Ark Raiders is portraying. It is a world where the authoritative account of events is always a product of power, not just of accuracy, where history is contested not just by honest disagreements about interpretation, but by the active management of which evidence survives and which memories are validated, where the past is a resource that factions mine for legitimacy and that communities mine for identity, and where the truth of what happened is not simply available, but must be assembled imperfectly from the fragments that survive the management process. This is, of course, also a description of the actual world. History has always worked this way. The game just strips away the layers of institutional authority that normally obscure this, by setting the story in a period when those institutions are new enough to be visibly under construction and old enough to have already started practicing the management behaviours that characterise established institutions. The chapter ends where it began, with the recognition that the moment no one remembers the same way is not a special moment, it is every moment. Every significant event in the post-Arch world is narrated differently by different parties. Every founding decision is contested. Every distribution of resources is interpreted differently from different positions. The law does not offer a view from nowhere. It offers multiple views from somewhere, and it trusts the reader to do the work of reading between them. Chapter 11. The people left outside the story. Every history has people at its centre and people at its edges. The people at the centre get names and documented decisions and legible arcs. The people at the edges get references, statistics, and the occasional personal log recovered from a salvage context. The law of Arch raiders, like every history, tells you something important through the distribution of its attention. This chapter is about the people at the edges, who they are, what they know, and what their perspective adds to the larger picture. The unaffiliated populations of the Arch raiders' world occupy more physical territory than any single faction, but less documented territory than almost any of them. They are the people who live in the spaces between faction spheres of control, who move through the margins of the underground world, who survive through combinations of personal technical skill, small group cooperation, and staying outside the notice of actors with the power to incorporate or eliminate them. The law touches them obliquely, through the records of people who encountered them rather than through their own documents. What is visible through these encounters suggests communities with highly developed practical knowledge, strong internal social bonds by necessity, and a complex relationship with faction systems. They are not simply anti-faction. Many of them have traded with factions, worked for factions temporarily, or cooperated with faction actors when it served both parties. They are not ideologically pure rejectionists. They are people who have found that the costs of faction affiliation, the obligations, the restrictions on movement, the hierarchical requirements outweigh the benefits in their specific circumstances. The practical knowledge possessed by unaffiliated communities is referenced consistently in faction operational records, almost always in the context of trying to acquire it. Faction technicians encountering salvage sites that have been worked by unaffiliated operators often note the quality of the work. Root knowledge held by itinerant traders without faction affiliation is described as operationally valuable. Environmental reading skills developed by people who have spent their lives moving through Arch active zones are noted as exceeding those of faction-trained personnel. This knowledge is largely undocumented in any archive because the communities that possess it do not have the infrastructure to document it systematically. It exists in practice and in oral transmission. When individuals from these communities are absorbed into faction structures, the knowledge they carry tends to be appropriated and used without systematic acknowledgement of its origin. The faction archive records the technique. The person who brought it from outside is a footnote if they appear at all. The children of unaffiliated communities are in some ways the most interesting cases in the law. They grow up with the most direct exposure to the actual physical environment of the post-Arch world, moving through it rather than being protected from it by faction infrastructure. Their environmental knowledge is consequently deep. Their awareness of arc patterns, of surface conditions, of the geography of the underground margins is documented in the few accounts that exist as remarkable. They also grow up outside the faction narrative structures. They are not educated in any faction's origin story or told that any particular faction represents their best hope for survival. Their framework for understanding the post-Arch world is built more directly from experience and from the oral traditions of their communities than from institutional narrative. What this produces, according to the fragmentary accounts in the law, is a worldview that is in some ways more accurate about the mechanics of how the post-Arch world works, and in other ways less equipped to navigate the institutional politics that determine outcomes within faction systems. The gender dynamics of the law are worth addressing in this context, not because they are foregrounded dramatically, but because they are consistent enough to be clearly deliberate. The faction hierarchies documented in the law tend to show patterns of leadership concentration that map onto pre-arc social stratification in multiple dimensions, including gender. The people at the top of most faction structures are a fairly narrow demographic. The people doing the most physically dangerous operational work are more diverse. This pattern is not commented on in official faction documentation. It is visible in the data. The unaffiliated communities show somewhat different patterns. Not uniformly egalitarian, the law is not that optimistic, but the patterns of leadership and decision-making in unaffiliated communities are more varied, more contextual, and less institutionally fixed than in larger faction structures. Who leads in a given situation tends to be more determined by relevant competence and group trust than by pre-existing status in a hierarchy. This is partly a function of scale. Small groups can afford contextual leadership in ways that large organizations cannot, but the law notes it without attributing it purely to scale. The elderly population of the underground world is one of the most overlooked groups in the law, which is itself telling. In the early post-Arc period, age was a significant vulnerability. The physical demands of survival in a disrupted environment favoured youth and physical resilience.